Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to Chinon, and we're looking at the Château du Petit Thouars 2017 Chinon L'Épée. Built in 1420, perched up high above the Vienne River in the commune of St-Germain-sur-Vienne, the story of Château du Petit Thouars, as we know it today, begins in 1636, when Georges Aubert de Saint-Georges purchased the Château du Petit Thouars on the advice of Cardinal Richelieu, who he was working for at the time, and thus becoming the first Count of Petit Thouars, which was an impressive estate at the time with farmland, woodlands, and also vineyards. Since then, the chateau and estate have been passed down intact from father to son through the generations. The modern viticultural story of the estate begins in the late 1970s when Yves and Marguerite du Petit Thouars discovered in the family archives records of vineyards and wines produced at the estate dating to 1900. And this prompted them to make the decision to reestablish vineyards on the property. Today, it is the 12th generation, Sébastien du Petit Thouars and his wife Darcy, who own and manage the estate and its vineyards. And they're organically farming around 16 hectares of vines in the commune of St-Germain-sur-Vienne. And of this, about 13 hectares are planted with Cabernet Franc, and they have about 3 hectares of Chenin Blanc. So today's wine is taking us to the commune of St-Germain-sur-Vienne, which is on the south side or the left bank of the Vienne River in Chinon. Now, I don't often get a chance to talk about the terroir picture on the left bank of Chinon because the majority of the wines in the appellation are indeed produced on the north side of the Vienne River. So I do want to take a moment to provide a little bit of an overview of the viticultural landscape here, as well as share some of my recent observations about this area and its wines. So first and foremost, the commune of St-Germain-sur-Vienne is a relatively new addition to the Chinon appellation. It was formerly part of the Touraine AOC, and then in 2015, the Chinon AOC ratified its cahier des charges to include St-Germain-sur-Vienne and 7 additional communes: Seuilly, Lernay, Cuzier, Camp-Saint-Martin, Thizay, Ciney, and Brézé, all of which happen to be on the south side of the Vienne River, and thus expanding the Chinon AOC to include 26 communes of production. These 8 communes account for around 500 of the 2,400 hectares that make up the Chinon appellation. That's about 20% of the delineated vineyard area, though the production from these 8 communes is significantly less because not all of this delineated vineyard area is actually planted to vine. Now, with the exception of the commune of Brézé, not to be confused with Brézé, but Brézé, which is located further east along the Vienne River, these other 7 communes, including St-Germain-sur-Vienne, are actually clustered together in an area that is sometimes referred to as the Seuilly sector. Now, this area's viticultural landscape is defined by a few elements. We have the presence of the Seuilly-Lernay fault, which runs about 20 kilometers from east to west from the commune of Ligray to Sées. We also have the presence of the Vienne and how it cuts through the Chinon appellation from the southeast from the Loire River. And then we also have the rather large Fonfrot forest. Now, the combination of these geographical and geological factors allow us to group these 7 communes into essentially 2 groups from a terroir perspective. Now, beginning in the easternmost part of the commune of St-Germain-sur-Vienne and then continuing southeast along the Vienne into the communes of Thizay, Ciney, and then south into Seuilly and Lernay, the viticultural landscape here is actually dominated by soils that date to the Sinonian age. These are deeper clays and deeper sands, in some cases, that are mixed with a little bit of flint. Not too dissimilar, actually, to some of the soils that we find in the communes of La Roche-Clermont and Ligray, also on the south side of the Vienne River. And there's actually very little presence of the Turonian tuffo chalk influenced soils in these communes. In addition to this, the vineyard landscape is quite undulating, so we will find a number of different exposures here across these communes. And the vineyard area is set a ways back from the Vienne River, so there's less of a moderating influence from the Vienne. So the growing season tends to be a little bit shorter and the conditions overall a little bit cooler. Now, turning our attention to the central and westernmost parts of St-Germain-sur-Vienne, that's where we find Château du Petit Thouars and its vineyards, and then continuing northwest along the Vienne into the communes of Cuzier and also Caen-Saint-Martin, this terroir picture here is completely different. So the vineyards here are on the north side of the forest of Fontfroid, and the vineyards are actually at the confluence of where the Loire River meets the Vienne River. And the vineyards are on a plateau of Turonian tuffeau chalk. And this plateau of tuffeau chalk is an extension of the same tuffeau chalk plateau that hugs the Loire River in saumur-champigny. And in fact, if it wasn't for the administrative borders of the Indre-et-Loire and Maine-et-Loire departments, I would argue that these three communes of St-Germain-sur-Vienne, Cuzier, and Caen-Saint-Martin are actually more appropriately grouped from a terroir perspective with eastern saumur-champigny rather than the rest of Chinon. And essentially, St-Germain-sur-Vienne is the last commune furthest east before this tuffeau plateau that defines saumur-champigny actually ends. And I find this absolutely fascinating. Now, what does all this mean from a viticultural perspective and soil perspective? Well, in terms of soils here, we do have the influence of this Turonian tuffeau chalk exclusively. And the topsoils are quite shallow and dominated by clay. And then we hit the upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk bedrock after that. And it is predominantly the upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk. There are just a couple little pockets of the middle Turonian white tuffeau chalk. In addition to this, we are on a plateau here, so the vineyards are quite flat. So they have uninterrupted sun exposure throughout the growing season. And again, we are at the confluence of the Loire and Vienne rivers. So there are two moderating influences here. So the growing season tends to be longer and the conditions overall tend to be a bit warmer. Now, as a final observation on the terroir picture here on the left bank or the south side of the Vienne River here in Chinon, and I should preface that this is a rather preliminary observation based on my research and tastings and conversations with different vignerons, but there is a common thread that seems to link these 8 communes with the communes of La Roche-Clermont and Licré in particular. And that is when there is a presence of clay, it is a different clay somehow, a different clay than the clay that we find on the north side of the Vienne River. Now, this clay is heavier, it's denser, it's more compact, and when you hear the vignerons speak about this clay on the south side of the Vienne, they often refer to it as grosses argiles, meaning large or fat clays. And I have noticed from my tastings that wines coming from certain sites on the left bank of Chinon tend to have a different tannin profile. It's like the tannins are more pronounced. They're denser, they're chewier, and it creates these wines that are more structured, more powerful. And these wines often do require a little bit more time for these tannins to soften and resolve. That brings me to today's wine, which I happened to have an opportunity to taste when I was in the region back in October, same vintage even, the 2017, and that actually prompted me to remember, oh, I have a bottle of that in my cellar. I should use this as a jumping off point to talk about the left bank in Chinon and this commune and this particular part of the Chinon appellation. So the L'Épée, which translates to sword in French, is coming from around a 3-hectare parcel of vines from the Lydie Les Plantes, and this represents the heart of Château du Petit Thouars vineyard plantings. And the vines are from some of the oldest vines on the estate. They were planted by Sebastian's dad back in the late 1970s, so between 1978 and 1988. So in 2017, these would have been 30 to 40 or so year-old vines on average. This parcel where the vines are located, we are on that Tufo Plateau. However, it does have a slight southeast orientation. And then in terms of soils, we have very shallow soils here. We have about 40 centimeters of a pure heavy clay topsoil, and then we hit the upper Turonian yellow tufa chalk bedrock after that. Now, from a winemaking perspective, in 2017, the fruit for this wine was actually machine harvested, though they have since changed to exclusively harvesting their Cabernet Franc and Chenin Blanc by hand. And then the fermentation and the approach to fermentation was a rather classic red wine fermentation. So destemmed fruit, fermentation in stainless steel with indigenous yeast, and the fermentation temperature would have been a little bit warmer than what we would typically see today, around 30 degrees Celsius. They would have done more extractive techniques, so pump overs twice daily, and the total time on skins was about 20 days. The finished wine is a combination of free-run wine and press wine. It was about 2/3 free-run wine and about 1/3 press wine. And then the aging takes place in third or fourth use oak barrels for about 18 months before the wine is then bottled. So let's dive into this 2017 L'Épée. Oh, I should note as well, before I get into the wine, in terms of the 2017 vintage, this was a very nice vintage. It was a frost year, but nice conditions in terms of the growing season. So warmer, quite sunny, kind of similar to 2009 in a way. And also I wanted to note with regards to Château du Petit Thouars' approach with their wines, their work in the vineyards as well. A lot has changed for the estate in recent years. They converted to organic viticulture in 2019, and they've also made a lot of changes in the cellar. So they've bought some new equipment, they've bought different vessels. They are now working with some 50 hectoliter oak foudre for some micro vinifications. Their approach to fermentation is a little bit different now, less extractions, cooler fermentation temperature, less time on skins. So there's been some important changes in the cellar with respect to Château du Petit Thouars in recent years, which is important to keep in mind with respect to their wines. So let's dive in. So the nose on this wine is really lovely. It isn't super aromatic per se. I would say it's got a lot more depth to it. It kind of goes down into the glass, but there is a really lovely fragrance. And I am starting to get some nice tertiary notes on this wine, which I quite like. And I would say the fruit profile leans a little bit on the darker side. So I'm getting a mix of like black raspberry. There's a bit of black currant here. There's a little bit of a plummy note as well. And some of those fruit profiles are kind of leaning a little bit more into that dried spectrum. And the herbal profile is quite pretty. It does lean a little bit more fruit forward for me, but the herbal profile is almost like a cooling herb or cooling kind of foresty sensation. Kind of like a cedar. There's a bit of sturdy, twiggy herbs like rosemary or thyme. And yeah, there's a beautiful fragrance to this wine that is really particular. It almost reminds me of incense, like I'm in a church, like the church incense. So what is that? Like frankincense and myrrh, I guess? Yeah, it has this wonderful incense kind of like perfume to it. There are some nice autumnal notes that are coming through as well, which is very typical of Chinon with a little bit of age. And yeah, I'm really starting to appreciate the tertiary kind of elements that are coming through in this wine. And I should note as well, I actually did a video on this exact wine over 4 years ago. And it was really cool for me to be able to kind of revisit this in October and now do a nice deep dive on this wine and this part of Chinon. Because when I did that first video back in 2020, it was only my fourth video. It was very early days of Franc Chronicles, and this is video 150. And so a lot has changed since then. And so it's kind of nostalgic to revisit this wine in this moment. But yeah, it smells great. It smells fantastic. Very classic as well in terms of that overall profile. Just old school Chinon with a little bit of age, which is awesome. The fruit profile on the palate is very similar to the nose. I would say pretty bang on. If anything, there's a little bit more of a sweet tart profile, like that black raspberry comes through in a really, really nice way. The herbal profile comes through nicely. That frankincense-esque kind of aromatic profile comes through as well. There's a little bit more of a spice, classic kind of baking spice profile on the palate, like a bit of star anise, some clove here, perhaps a touch of allspice. There's even a little bit more of a potpourri-like note, like dried floral note as well on the palate. The acidity is really, really vibrant, really persistent as well. And it's kind of crescendoing. The way the acidity kind of builds through the palate is really, really nice. And I feel the acidity kind of up here in my upper jaw, which is quite lovely. The tannins are very velvety, kind of densely packed. They're a little bit kind of chewy in a way, and that's very much in keeping from what I remember from my tasting of this wine 4 years ago, is the tannins do have a distinct kind of chew to them, which is really interesting. Yeah, the tannins are great. There's a nice chalkiness to the finish as well. And the structure of this wine is quite interesting. So there's two things that are kind of happening here. I'm getting this density and this breadth from the clay. It's kind of creating this sensation of pulling this way. And then at the same time, we have very shallow soils here and a strong impact of the tuffeau, which is creating this sense of verticality in the wine as well. And it means that this wine feels like it's taking up a lot of space in the mouth. It's not full-bodied. It's not, it's not rich or anything like that. It's a medium-bodied wine, I would say. But it does feel like it takes up a lot of space. There's a lot of structure here to this wine. There's concentration as well. And that's kind of creating a really, really distinctive, sturdy, kind of regal profile about this wine. Yeah, it's great. It's medium-bodied, as I said, very contemplative, structured. This is serious. This is a serious wine for sure. And it does have a little bit, I would say, this has got lots of life left in it. I would say at least 10 years, probably even more than that. But it's in a really, really beautiful place at the moment. And it's just such a pleasure to revisit this wine. As I said, it kind of is a bit nostalgic for me to think of, how much has changed with respect to Franc Chronicles and how far I've come with this project since I tasted this wine 4 years ago. But I'm a huge fan of Château du Petit Thouars and what Sébastien and Darcy are doing at the estate. And I think their wines, at least the recent vintages that I have tasted of their wines, they just keep getting better and better and better. So if you're not familiar with this estate, this is definitely one to put on your radar. The wines are quite available, particularly in North America and also parts of Europe. So this is definitely one to put on your radar. And if you've had the wines from Château du Petit Thouars, I would love to know what you thought of them and whether or not you notice any of these interesting observations that I have made with respect to this particular part of Chinon, the left bank, or even this little corner of Chinon very close to saumur-champigny. I would love to know your insights on that. Hit me up in the comments below as always. And of course, as always, I will also be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.